many of us are on. Honey, how many are on or have been admitted? Do you know?
Hi.
There's 18. You should be able to see it because you're a co-host.
Okay, well, I don't have it easily accessible, but anyhow, we'll carry on. Okay, so can everybody see the screen? Okay, so I'd like to welcome you to this. I just wanted to give, first of all, give a kind of a shout out to Rosie Sellick and Bela Lubeck, who have been co-chairs of our Adult Education Committee. They're actually the outgoing chairs of it, but I just want to dedicate this to them. They have done an incredible job getting our all our educational work set up and schedules in the last number of years, and they were hosts for my series that I gave at the Beth David on this Science in the Bible in the last several months. So I just want to send a shout out to them. So just to give you a context, I put together a 6 lecture series on the narratives of Genesis and Exodus and a study of Kabbalah and how it was applied in modern geography. And I put the series together and gave it over the winter months this past year. Fortunately, we finished just before the COVID epidemic took over. And I know some of you were at some of these, so if this talk sounds familiar, it's the second of the 6 talks. And first of all, as any scientific presentation, I always declare I don't have any financial interests or conflicts of interest. So this was the series. And last week, we did the flood of Noah and the Garden of Eden, where and when they occurred. And there, as I mentioned, there's archaeologic and historical evidence that both events did occur, far more remote into previous time than a lot of people realize. Today we're going to do the creation story and the link of Purim to Passover. The link of Purim to Passover and the creation story is not available in any source. It is a chidush, which means from the Hebrew word chadash, it means something new. It's something that you won't find anywhere else. It's a conjecture of my own, but I'll present that to you a little bit later. The other talks are the ones I've listed here. There is a talk I gave on dating matriarch and patriarch stories in Joseph, and that's possible to do from various angles. The binding of Isaac, or the Akedah, is my conjecture as to what the message of the Akedah really was, not a trial, but actually a lesson to Abraham. And I've saved that to present, I've submitted that for inclusion in the Limud Day, which takes place in November. It's a learning day, a Jewish learning day. I'd be happy to give it at another time, but that's one that I've saved and yet to hear whether they've accepted it or not. I gave a talk about a month and a half ago about the Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Temple, where it lay on the Temple Mount and where the Holy of Holies was. That's something many of you were fortunate to see. And then there's one talk on Kabbalah, geometry, and modern geography, which is a kind of a separate talk, but it comes out of some of the talk, some of the work we're going to talk about today. So, just have to get this going forward. There's a new one that I put together. I mentioned it to some of you about hidden messages in biblical Hebrew and the deeper meaning of the letters and the words. Now, I've just completed that as of this week. I'm not going to give it next week. I want to save it for an evening. So I'm hoping sometime in July, I'll be able to do that. I want to do it in an evening because I've got some colleagues and people in different time zones who would like to be able to see it and not have to get up too early in the morning. But I thought it would be maybe reach a wider audience if we did it in an evening because a lot of people are heading back to work now in this after the shutdown. So those are the talks. But as I mentioned in the series of these 7 talks, there's many different areas of science that we touch on. And to understand each of the group of these talks, you have to really have a little bit of background in all of these different areas of science. And so today we're going to talk about the science behind the creation story. And I gave you these timelines from last week. These are these various talks. The first 4 of the 7 talks actually deal with the timing of these various events. Today we're going to talk about the creation, but last week we talked about the Garden of Eden and the flood of Noah. And as you may recall, the evidence for the presence of an area called Eden comes from deep ancient Armenian literature and from the Book of Enoch and from other sources that dates to the 9th millennium BCE. And Noah's flood comes from the evidence from marine archaeology of the Black Sea. And the events of the Garden of Eden and the events of Noah's flood, all related in the Bible in the same parsha, Berasheet, and then Noah, are all in the same geographical area. So it makes sense that this is probably where these events occurred. So they occurred in a much deeper, remote time in history as part of folklore that was brought forward and eventually written down. So going back to the creation of the universe, when did it actually get created? So we go to chapters 1 to 4 of Genesis, and here are the areas of science that we're going to have to deal with in order to understand the various aspects. And when I talk about the story of creation, we're actually going to look at it from 4 different aspects. So these are the areas of science that we'll be touching on today. I want to give you some references. These are books that are pretty well known among people who are interested in the subject. Gerald Schroeder was a lecturer. He was a PhD in physics, who used to teach at one of the Ivy League universities. He now has lived in Israel for many years, but he wrote some books about the science and how you can relate from different aspects of science to Genesis and the Big Bang and the science of God. He's quite a prolific writer, and his books have been out for many years, and I'm sure you can get them on Amazon or other sources. Leonora Leet was a professor of English who delved into Kabbalah for many years and studied with some of the top Kabbalists in the United States and Israel, and wrote a book called The Secret Doctrine of the Kabbalah, which I've referred to in a couple of my talks here. And then I just want to shout out to Howard Gans, who one of my co-members at Beth David, who's also a bit of nerdy into the same things that I enjoy here, into all this biblical stuff. And he and I have gone back and forth for many years, giving each other titles to read. And he gave me these 2 books by Daniel Friedman called The Genesis 1 Code and The Broken Gift, which talk about synthesizing Kabbalah and other sources to understand the nature of the story in Genesis. So those books have been, again, are out and accessible. And then finally, Maimonides, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, his guide for the perplexed called the Moreh Nevuchim, also we're going to refer to here as well. So we're going to start with the creation story, Maaseh Berasheet. So I just want to give you a little quiz. I like throwing little questions out and little historical anecdotes. When was baseball created? And in an in-person lecture, it actually is a little more fun because people can shut out the answer. But the answer is at the time of creation, because it actually says in Genesis 1:1 that in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, right? See a few laughs out there. Okay, good. So the question is, how old is the universe? In 2013, NASA sent up with the Planck spacecraft, which measures microwave background radiation, which is thought to be the signal from the Big Bang, as they say. And by the tapering off of the microwave radiation into the universe and the recording of these levels, they have found that the universe is somewhere around 13.8 billion years old. So the question is, does the Maaseh Berasheet correlate with that or not? And I'll give you the answer. By the end of the hour, you'll see that they actually synthesize perfectly. So here are the timelines. And if we put the creation of the universe simply based on the microwave background radiation, which is currently the standard that's been used to define the duration of universe 13.8 billion years ago. So the question is, when was the idea of a Big Bang? You've all heard about the Big Bang. I'm not talking about the TV show. I'm talking about the Big Bang from physical theory, that all the components of the universe were in one highly dense volume that suddenly explodes, populates the entire cosmos. Everything we know in the universe came from this one nucleus here. When was it first described? How many of you think it was Einstein in 1905? Or Hubble? And this is the name of the telescope is named after him. He was the one who actually found out that the universe is accelerating in its expanse and developed equations to define that. Lemaitre and Hoyle were the first who actually talked about not a big bang, but about a source that expanded and took all the matter from one source and went out. So how many of you think that they were the first to coin or talk about a big bang and put this theory out? Well, I'm going to leave that for just a few minutes because the answer is actually going to surprise you, because none of these people were the first to describe it. And the person who first described it is going to it's going to make your jaws drop, but let's get there a little bit later. So first of all, was creation really done in 6 days? And if so, for whom was it done? What do they mean by choshech, the word choshech, which is in the beginning, the first few verses? And why are tehom and taninim, these two words, are specifically mentioned in the creation story? And they have a very important significance here. Also, in chapter 4, verse 22, there's a lineage of Adam that reaches this generation of a gentleman named Tuval Cain, and for whatever reason, the Bible decides to throw out the fact of what his occupation was. The question is why, or how does that help you? And the next is our Erev and Boker. That's every day after a day of creation, there's Vayhi Erev, Vayhi Boker. What do they actually mean? The answer is they do not mean evening and morning. That's modern Hebrew. But as I mentioned many times in my talks, you actually have to go back to the ancient Hebrew meaning of these words. And why is Maaseh Berasheet related to Purim and Passover? The answer is they are intimately related, and we'll talk about that later on. So here are the 4 topics. We're going to look at the Maaseh Berasheet from 4 different aspects. First, the Kabbalistic paradigm, which I presented to some of you in other talks as well. The physics behind the creation story, then the parallels between the Megillah of Esther and Maaseh Berasheet, and finally, the Genesis codes from the books of Daniel Friedman, which I alluded to before. So let's talk about the Kabbalistic paradigm of creation. Now, I mentioned this last week, that there is from the Midrash Rabbah, that's the commentary on Genesis, that God put 7 things into the universe before he actually created it. First of all, the Torah we consider to be the blueprint for the creation of the world and the laws. Tshuva, to maintain human existence. The Garden of Eden, according to Midrash, was actually created and there before the creation of the world. Gehinom, as a punishment for the wicked. Kisei HaKavod, to manifest God's glory in the world. The Beit HaMikdash, the concept, the spiritual Beit HaMikdash was created before it was physically created in the time of Solomon. And the Shema Mashiach, the humanity's goal, to reach the days of Mashiach. These were all created according to the Midrash before the actual creation that we read in the Torah. So the Kabbalists actually use each day with a geometric array. So the first day, Vayhi Erev, that's Vayhi Or, God created light. And light has what's called vergence. So to my ophthalmology colleagues, they'll recognize the word vergence. This is a negative vergence where things are spread out from a source, and we designate that as a triangle. And since the sun and the light comes from above, we put that above. On the second day, God separated the waters. Vayhi mavdil bein mayim lamayim. So we designate that as a separation of waters, and we consider that 2 lines as a paradigm for that. Day 3, he could convene the waters on the land into one place. But in order to keep water in its place, you have to have mountains or land on either side to keep it there. He also created some greenery at the time. Day 4, he finally created the great Ma'or Hagadol, Ma'or HaKatan, the great light-producing object and the smaller light-producing object, which are the sun and the moon, as well as the stars, and they come up from above again. And then on day 5, he started to create life. V'yishutzu hamayim, in the waters, he created the fish, And in the sky, he created the flying things, the of, she of faith, that the birds that will fly. On day 6, the rest of humanity and life, and there's our animal friends and human friends on land. And if you put this all together, you'll actually see something that gets created that is an eternal symbol of not just Judaism, but of many other cults and many other religions as well. So this Kabbalistic view of creation develops what's called a hexagram. I didn't say Star of David, it's hexagram. It's not a unique Jewish symbol. And in fact, there are several religions that use that. It became a Jewish symbol only in the last couple of centuries. It's also used in Hindu temples. It also appears on Muslim tombs. And in the center of Stonehenge, is actually a symbol of the hexagram, which is considered to be a pagan symbol with various implications. And there's many, many other mystic interpretations of the hexagram as well. But as you know, the symbol of Judaism for centuries was not the Star of David, it was actually the menorah. And if you go back to tombs and ancient times, you'll see that actually on tombs, these are ossuaries, even going back 2 or 3 centuries after the Common Era, and even going back to the 1st century, they were menorahs that were the actual symbol of Judaism. So the Star of David, while it's something that's modern, was not the original symbol of Judaism, and but it was a symbol for many religions, and the Kabbalists used it as well as a paradigm of creation. Now, in this lecture that I give on the Kabbalah and modern geography, we actually take that hexagram and expand it according to the text of the Torah, and it creates the tree of life diagram, which again is part of the Kabbalistic philosophy. So we're not going to go there today, but that's where that would go. So that is the paradigm of creation according to the Kabbalists. And that's topic number 1. Topic number 2 we'll get to in just a minute, but I just thought I would show you again my perusal through history of general history. Any idea what this is a photo of? The first photo by an explorer by the name of Hiram Bingham. And that were the first views of Machu Picchu when they were rediscovered in 1912. So now about the physics behind the creation story. So we have to have, first of all, we have to delve a little bit into physics. And there are actually 4 dimensions in modern life. There's more dimensions according to, physicists and so on, but the main 4 dimensions that we live in, we'll describe in just a moment. We have to talk about relativity, that time is not a constant. And we have to talk again about choshech. We have to figure out who Tehom and Taninim were, because they're specifically mentioned in the early few verses. We also have to ask why Tuval Cain was actually given his occupation, but it links to the Bronze Age and dates the events of Adam and his successors. What do Erev and Boker actually mean, and the paradox, the physical paradox that actually defines the creation story? And it's actually alluded to by Onkelos, who's an Aramaic interpreter who translated the Bible, but not exactly. And one of the nuances of his translation from the 2nd century on the 1st chapter, verse 31, is very telling. So first of all, the 4 dimensions, our visible world, as you know, is created in 3 dimensions of length, width, and height. But there is a 4th dimension, and that's an invisible one, which is time. Now, when I was growing up, as many of you I'm sure were saying, that you put on a watch or you look at a clock and time goes by in an hours and days and weeks and so on, and we have leap years and so on. But time is time, it's consistent everywhere in the world. But actually, it turns out that time is not constant. Time actually is a variable that depends on how fast you are going, the velocity of a system. So the faster you go, the slower time will pass. And the slower you go, the more normal time will go. So this is something that was actually learned, about a century ago, and this is where Einstein came in, that time is not a constant. And they've actually verified this from, I believe it's from either the Apollo or Space Lab missions, where they actually had clocks on board spacecraft. And during their 14-day or let's say 3-month journey, they actually looked at the time clocks and compared them to atomic time clocks, so really accurate times on Earth. And it turns out that the astronauts going at whatever high speed they were going around the Earth, their clocks were slowed down by, it may have just been minutes, but actually time is not constant. That's been verified now by some of the space missions. And so you can imagine if you're going near the speed of light, time slows down to almost a trickle. Another part of the element is, what do they mean by choshech? Choshech is not lack of light, but it's actual physical darkness. And at the moment of creation, all matter was at a location of high density and high temperature, and light could not escape. And what choshech is not the lack of light, but it's what we now call dark matter. And dark matter is something that astrophysicists have been looking for as an explanation as to how to explain how fast the universe is expanding. And they're still looking for it because they've done all kinds of studies and they're still looking to see what the substance actually is. But the choshech is listed in the Bible as a substance, not just lack of light. At the time of the Big Bang, though, everything exploded from a small nucleus and went out at the speed of light, and time was not the same as we have now on Earth. So I bring up this question to you: when was this idea of a Big Bang where all the components were blown apart from a source first described? None of these apply. The first time was in the 13th century of the Common Era. Now you're going to look and say, how would they have known this? Well, that's part of the jaw-dropping stuff that you read when you delve into the Bible. It was Nachmanides, okay, not Maimonides, but Nachmanides, who was, I think, his nephew or grandson, who's Ramban, and he delves a lot into mystical stuff and philosophy. And if you look at Mikraot Gedolot, which is the Bible, that's the Hebrew Bible that we study from, that has all the commentaries, like 20 commentaries on every page, he is the most voluminous. So I don't know if I'd want to go to one of his sermons, because they probably went on for days and days and days if you ever talked to his students. But he was the most prolific writer. And if you look for his writing, it's in regular Hebrew. It's like in Hebrew rather than the Rashi script. And he talked in his time, he talked about, in Genesis here, that all of what we see on the earth and the universe was squeezed into a tiny volume no larger than a grain of mustard. He wrote this in the 13th century, that all matter, everything God created at one time, was within a space less than 1 kilometer wide. Now, how does he know that? Then he says, from all of that, all of the acts of creation, everything that's existed or formed came from this one nucleus source. So it wasn't Einstein, it wasn't Hubble, it wasn't Hoyle. It was 7 centuries earlier that somebody actually came up with the idea that everything was created from a small area and then it populated the entire cosmos. And that the acts of creation, he actually said that it's a secret that can only be understood and requires knowledge passed on verbally from Moses. Now, in my talk on Kabbalistic geometry, I actually mentioned that there's 3 pillars of Sinai. There's the written Torah, the Torah that we were given, the oral Torah, which is the Mishnah, and now was expanded into the Talmud and Gemara. But there was a 3rd pillar, which is alluded to very cryptically in some of the passages in Exodus, which we call a mystic philosophy, and which is also in modern times, we call that Kabbalah. But there's many other parts of that. And what Ramban goes into is a lot of this mystical philosophy of what all this is. But we think that there was a verbal passing of a 3rd pillar, as well as the Mishnah, from Sinai through the generations. And somehow some of this percolated through, and Ramban wrote it down 7 centuries ago. So what he's describing and what the Big Bang means is that from this nucleus, this center, where light could not escape, all of a sudden it blew apart and expanded at the speed of light. And now that light could escape, it would have been sent out at the speed of light. And time was going to be very different in God's frame of reference at the time that he created the universe. So matter dispersed at almost the speed of light, and time slows significantly, to the point that what could be a year in our time could be a matter of seconds in the frame of reference of when God created the universe. And so we call this cosmic time. It's the time that was within God's frame of reference at the time of creation. And when everything blew apart and expanded at the speed of light, time was going at a very, very slow pace. So within God's frame of reference in cosmic time, time slowed dramatically so that the entire creation process within his frame of reference could have taken days instead of millennia. But in human time, as we know it, the process could have taken billions of years. So just looking at the physics of the creation, the physics of the expansion from the Big Bang that was created, time did not have to be a constant. So the question then is, when did cosmic time, this time that was slowed by the expansion of the universe, and our time that we measure in our clocks on Earth, when did they actually synchronize? Because going forward from the time of the Bible, time actually ran, if you read the Nevi'im and the Ketuvim, time ran like we do now. So somewhere in those early days, in those early chapters of Genesis, cosmic time and human time had to synchronize for the stories to go forward. The Rambam, now we're going a couple centuries earlier, this is Maimonides, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon. In his Guide to the Perplexed, he actually tells you when they came together. On the first Sabbath, that's on day 7 of creation, when God rested. When God created the nephesh or soul, which is vayinafash. So when God created the vayinafash, when he imbued humans with a soul, that's when he synchronized cosmic time and human time. And from that point on, time was real time as we know it on Earth. As I mentioned, choshech is not lack of light, but the dark matter that contains the energy from that original Big Bang, which is still a holy grail for astrophysicists. And that's still there. So even though light expanded, there's still this remnant, this background of dark matter that is the choshech that was there at the time of creation. Now, what about Tehom and Taninim? Tehom is actually the name of the Babylonian goddess called Tiamat, originally associated with the original primordial sea before order was imposed. Taninim are actually serpents. It's translated in some circles as serpents, but it's actually the equivalent of what we call Leviathan, which is the dragon god from Canaanite myths and forces of evil within the world. However, Leviathan actually has a relationship, according to Kabbalistic mythology, has a link to the world itself. And if you look at, this is the Sfirot of the Kabbalistic tree of life, according to the Kabbalah. The 7th one that's hidden, called Da'at, or knowledge. And if you look at the Hebrew, this is the Hebrew of the Sfirot. And the one at the bottom is called Malchut, which is kingdom. Malchut, you can see, is the support from Kabbalistic philosophy, is the support for the tree of life. It's the root. It's the one that holds it together and keeps it elevated. And the overt meaning of Leviathan is a giant sea monster, but in Kabbalistic doctrine, the meaning of Leviathan is the world. So when it says Vayivra et Taninim, it's actually creating the world, the substance of earth. And the Sphira of Malchut supports the entire world. Now, if you take the gematria, so if you're into numerology, And you take the word Leviathan and the word Malchut. The reason that the Kabbalists say that they are equivalent, that Malchut is supporting the tree of life and is a symbol for world, is equivalent to Leviathan, is because numerically they are exactly equivalent, 496. But not only in 496, 496 is a special number. It's called a perfect number. A perfect number in mathematics is a number that is equal to all of its divisors. So if you take the number 6, for instance, that's the first perfect number. The numbers that divide into it are 1, 2, and 3. So it's numbers other than the number itself. And if you add its divisors, 1 plus 2 plus 3, you get the same number, 6. The next number after that is 28. And the third number that is a perfect number is 496. If you add its divisors, it comes out to the same sum, 496. So what does that mean? According to Kabbalistic thought, since it's a perfect number, God did not create a perfect world. We are required to repair the aspects, which is what we call tikkun olam, that he left unfinished or imperfect, to bring it to perfection, to make it a perfect number, equivalent to Leviathan. So what are Tehom and Taninim? It's a lesson for the Israelites who were in the desert receiving the 10 Commandments, and when God wrote the Torah, or Moses wrote it down, that the lesson for the Israelites is that these are names of gods, but they are not godly because they are subservient to Hashem, and that Hashem is the supreme creator. So he actually is the creator of the world, the perfect world that we have to maintain, and that's equivalent to the Taninim or Leviathan, and that Tehom or Tiamat, which the Israelites would have been exposed to in their travels. They would have been exposed to the gods of other nations, that these nations are still subservient and that God is the supreme creator. And that is the message of putting these in, and that they are words that are not just blandly put in, but they are in there for a significance from a Kabbalistic and also a religious point of view. Now, what about Tuval Cain in the Bronze Age? As I mentioned, according to Maimonides, by the end of Berasheet, the Parsha, human and cosmic time synchronized to time as we know it now on Earth. We said in Genesis chapter 4:22, in generation of Tuval Cain, he's listed as a forger of bronze tools, of Choresh Nechoshet. And if you look at the genealogical line of Cain, we get to Tuval Cain, and it matches the parallel lines of the other generations, the genealogies that are in the chapter, because Tuval Cain came through the lineage of Cain, and Noah came through the lineage of his other son, Seth. But they are parallel generations, and so if we know when Noah's generation was, we'll actually know when Tuval Cain's generation was. So if we have the present year, 5780, and you delete the years from Adam to Noah, and we did this calculation last week. If you remember, we tried to relate the flood of Noah and went back to the generations of Adam and Noah. You can actually see from the Pshat, from Genesis, that the years from Adam to Noah were 1,360 years. And you subtract that from 5780, our current Hebrew year, then these people, the generation of Tuval Cain, would have lived 4,420 years ago, around the year 2400 BCE. And if you look at the artifacts in any museum, the first appearance of bronze tools at the early Bronze Age in archaeology is at 2400 BCE. So in other words, he was listed as a forger of bronze, and by very interesting fortuitous calculation, according to cosmic and human time now being synchronized, it actually matches exactly when the Bronze Age began, according to our current calculations of the current Hebrew year. And that verifies the biblical dates. So the age of Tuval Cain was exactly perfectly synchronized, verifying what Maimonides said, that by that time, human and cosmic time had synchronized. And what about Erev and Boker? It says after every day of creation, Vayhi Erev, Vayhi Boker, commonly translated as day or evening and morning. But that's not the meaning of the words. You can't have a morning and an evening if you don't have a sun and a moon, and you don't have the planets actually formed yet. So the meanings of these words, and I have to give credit, I don't remember which rabbi it was, but it was a lecture I attended at Beth David one Sunday afternoon for an adult education program. And the rabbi who spoke was talking about the meanings of these words. And I think he was absolutely right. The word boker means clear, non-random, and ordered. The word Erev means obscure, random, and chaotic. Now, if you've heard anything about thermodynamics and other physical states, there are states we call order and chaos. And every day it said, God saw that it was good, Vayhi Tov. And then on the very last day, he said it was very good, Vayhi Tov Me'od, after he created life. Onkelos, the translator of the Aramaic translator, who was actually a convert, by the way, and in the 2nd century, in his commentary for the word Vayhi Tov, he said, V'chaza ari tuv, that it was good. But the word very good, he does not translate in the Aramaic very good. He says, V'chada takin lechada, it was a unified order. A different word. He used a totally different word. And that's a very key to the understanding of what was this. If you look at the laws of thermodynamics, think back to high school, the law number 1 of thermodynamics is that reactions taking place in a closed system are that there's a sum of energy and mass remains constant. Okay, we're going to leave that for now. That's Einstein and other things. But law number 2 says the entropy of a system increases with time. It means that organized energy and ordered energy goes to disorganized energy. That is the natural laws that we have now. So in a closed system, if things are ordered, they will eventually go into chaotic or non-ordered or random. The trend in the universe, the physical laws that God put in for us, the natural laws that we learn from and follow, is that the universe goes towards chaos, any physical system, not to order. It starts with order, ends in chaos. But the problem is, if normal physical systems go to order to chaos, according to the 2nd law of thermodynamics that we live with, in the creation story, it goes from Erev to Boker, which is chaos to order, which is not the natural physical laws that God gave us. When he created the earth, when he created the universe, he created a physical system that follows order to chaos, not chaos to order. So Maimonides in the Moreh Nevuchim, again in the Guide to Perplexed, makes the point that there in the act of creation, there was a reversal of the normal physical process. It was not done to a natural order of physics. It could not have been done in a natural way. So when did the natural processes and the laws of science as we know, when did this reversal that could not be natural begin to be brought to the current knowledge that we have, the current situation where order goes to chaos? And again, according to the Guide to the Perplexed, it was on the 6th day of creation when humans were given command of nature and animals. So again, by the 6th day of creation, God ceded the natural laws to us to control, but now he changed it from the unnatural chaos to order back to what he gave us in the natural processes of order to chaos. And that was synchronized at just like time on the 6th day of creation. I'm talking about creation. If you haven't seen this before, this is the correct construction of the Eiffel Tower in 1888. So we're creating something, and now we can take this order, chaos to order, from natural or unnatural to another level. And this is the Chiddush that I told you is something that I've learned from reading and just things that hit me about 5 years ago. It's one of those aha moments, you know, where you sort of reach something that you've heard at a lecture or something you've read suddenly gels and you can start to relate different things. So what I'm going to tell you now is something that is not written anywhere, but is something that I thought would be something worth thinking about. And that is the parallels of the Megillah of Esther and the Maaseh Berasheet. Now, how could they be related? Well, let's go back to the Megillah of Esther. The Megillah of Esther has a lot of hidden meanings and many layers. One of the things that is always touted that people say is that the name of God is not mentioned in the Megillah. It's just like the name of Moses is not overtly mentioned in the Haggadah, but we know that he's behind a lot of the action there on Passover. In the Megillah of Esther, if you read all books about that, the name of God is not mentioned. But the question is it really not mentioned? It's actually hinted at in many, many ways because of the hidden forces at work. And if you look at the turning point of the plot, when things go from disaster to actually positive outcomes for the Jews, or we could say going from chaos to order. And how does the Purim to Passover interval of the 4 weeks that we have every year relate to the story of creation? So we say the name of God is not mentioned. It's not mentioned in the actual book of Esther that we have, the common version that we have. But there is a group of books called the Apocrypha. The Apocrypha are books that were existing at the time that the Tanakh, the Old Testament, was put together as we know it. There were certain books that were put in and certain books that the sages, for whatever reason, decided not to put in. And in the Apocrypha, there is a book of Esther. It's also translated by the Septuagint. So in the 2nd century, when it was translated into Greek for the first time, there's actually a prolonged book of Esther, longer than the one we have. Because if you know that we have chapters 1, verse 1, going to the very end, is chapter 10, verse 3. Every chapter in the book of Esther that we have is at least 20 or 25 verses long. Why is chapter 10 only 3 verses? Well, the answer is because that's not all of chapter 10. According to the Apocrypha, there is actually 15 chapters. The Septuagint translation into Greek has many more volumes. There's more paragraphs than we have in the current version of Esther. Verse 10, chapter 10, verse 4 has the lineage of Mordecai. And wouldn't you know, the first verse after 10:3, at 10:4, it says, Mordecai said, Hashem, God, had done these things. So in the Apocrypha, the name of God actually appears several times. So it's in the Apocrypha, it's also in the Septuagint. And when's the turning point of the plot? We know that the plot is so complex. You know, within 10 chapters, we go from an orderly Achashverosh and Vashti, and then all of a sudden the plot goes crazy, it gets a new queen and things happen, and things don't look very good for the Jews. And then there's a lottery that Haman actually gets a date to eliminate the Jewish problem. And it's in verse 3, chapter 3, verse 13, the actual lottery puts it on Adar 13. And we know that whenever we have Purim in a leap year, it's put in the 2nd Adar, so that there is a constant time between Purim and Pesach. It doesn't change from 1 month and every 3rd year or so to 2 months. It actually stays 4 weeks. And if it's a leap year, we always set it in Adar 2nd. So there's always this 4-week interval. And the turn of the plot is when Esther has to reveal her identity to Achashverosh to repeal Haman's evil decree. That occurs in chapter 5, verse 4. So when everything goes from really bad, a major peril for the Jews, to a change of the plot, the Shakespearean plot now goes in our favor, that major pivot occurs in chapter 5, verse 4, where Esther invites the king and Haman to a feast where she's going to reveal her identity and plead with Achashverosh to repeal his evil decree. The 4 words for her invitation are, Yavo HaMelech v'Haman Hayom. The king and Haman will come today. Look very carefully at the beginning word letter of each of those 4 words. Yavo HaMelech v'haman hayom. Can't put it in Hebrew because it's a sacred, but it's the tetragrammaton of God, the Yud-K, Vav-K, the holy letters of God's name. That is the change of the plot that brings the Jews a positive outcome, occurs at that pivotal point, and the name of God is hidden within the letters of those words. And what about the interval from the two? I said again that the lottery that Haman put out put the actual date of that lottery when the execution of the Jews would begin on Adar 13, or if it's the second month of Adar, a leap year, it's the second of Adar 13. It's also God's manifestations behind the plot. It's not a coincidence that it came on that date, because forever from that time on is a 4-week interval of the holiday cycle from Purim to Passover. And he set an annual challenge to us. Why? Because in Purim, you're masquerading to change your identity. It's the lowest personal constitutional time of the year where you're actually supposed to drink until you can't differentiate between the phrases of Arur Haman, which is the evil of Haman, and the blessing of Mordechai, Baruch Mordechai. So those two phrases are linked at Purim, that you're supposed to drink enough so that you don't pass out, but you can't differentiate between the evil of Haman and the blessing of Mordechai. In other words, it's the most chaotic and unpredictable festival of the year, just like the plot of the Megillah. It's totally chaotic. All kinds of things are happening, but God is driving that plot from below, keeping everything in line, including the date that he set. If you do and so a Jew is at her or his most based and informal personal state of the entire year at Purim. Passover is the opposite, the most formal and challenging festival. There's all kinds of rigorous laws and a heightened level of kashrut, changing your dishes, changing your whole outlook, and coming to what is the most ordered and personality-wise, the most ordered and special holiday where we have to fulfill laws that go beyond what we do every day. And there's a specific order to the proceedings. That's what the Seder means. Seder means order, the 14 steps, and that is exactly what we do after those 4 weeks, is we have to bring ourselves to the order of Passover. So in that interval, every Jew has to make a personal transformation from the frivolity and chaos of Purim, I use that word, to the formal ordered rituals of Passover. Now, it's very easy, from our personal situations, it's easy to go from, spiritually, from a time of formality to a time of relaxation and partying. That's very easy. For people, it's very easy to go from an ordered, structured situation and just to let your hair down, go down to your jeans and so on and just relax. It's very easy to go from the heights of order and that, personal-wise, down to just frivolity and just relaxation. It's much more challenging to ascend personality and spiritually, especially spiritually, from a relaxed state up to the highly ordered demands of Passover. Within 4 weeks, every one of us has to make this personal spiritual transition from the depths of chaos spiritually to the heights of order spiritually. That's against normal human behavior. So this personal transition from the heights of order, from the depths of chaos to the heights of order, is the spiritual equivalent from Purim to Passover of the physical acts that we've been talking about, Vayhi Erev, Vayhi Boker, of the physical transformation of God's creating the universe from chaos into order. So just as God has changed the natural order to create the universe from chaos to order, he set this 4-week challenge for us to do a spiritual transformation of the exact same thing spiritually from the chaos of Purim to the order of Passover. We have 4 weeks to do it, to make this spiritual transformation to mirror the physical acts that took billions of years physically, but in God's time, it took 6 days. He's given us a little longer. He's given us 4 weeks. And when you sit at the Seder table next year, hopefully it'll be in person, just reflect back on what you've done within 4 weeks, from the days of Purim to the formality of your family traditions as a Seder, and brought yourself every year from that lowest frivolity of Purim against the natural spiritual order up to the orders of Passover, which fulfills our mission as his emissaries on earth to take God's word as a Maaseh Berasheet. So I thought you might find that interesting as a match of what we talked about, of the unnatural physical acts of God taking the chaos to order each day, and what it means to us to do a spiritual equivalent of that every year from Purim to Pesach. We're going to the last section here, Journey into History. This is actually a photo, the very first photo of Earth from space. Certainly looks a lot clearer now when you see the astronauts taking photographs and movies of Earth. But this was the first attempt of taking a view from above the Earth. Now the Genesis codes. Talked about how old is the universe? I said that according to the Planck spacecraft and the microwave background radiation, it says 13.8 billion years is the best guess right now from 2013. So now I have to go a bit into Kabbalah and a bit into esoteric science, and I get the sources again are Daniel Friedman's books and Gerald Schroeder's books. You have to actually talk about time. We said time is not constant. And there's actually various time scales, biblical, Kabbalistic, and from the Tanakh. And you really have to do an in-depth study of Kabbalah, commentaries, and Talmud to actually get the little pieces of this jigsaw puzzle together. There are 3 different times. There's creation time, that is God's means of communicating with us, but is part of the remez and sod that we talk about in sort of the deep meanings of the Torah. And it's hidden by language, and you have to tease it out, and it's something that's not intuitive, and things that you actually have to get commentators from various sources to explain. The universe operates in what we call divine time. That's what we talked about earlier on. And then there's human time, which is the time clocks we have here on Earth. Now you have to use these sources to be able to relate these various times. Divine time, on which the universe operates, and human time has a factor that you can actually derive from the Tehillim, from Psalm 90, and from the Babylonian Talmud Sanhedrin. That one divine day in God's frame of reference is equal to 1,000 years of human time. And so a divine year is 365,000 plus human years. That's the conversion factor. Now, what about creation time that God uses, and divine time? You have to now go to Kabbalistic sources. These are the Kabbalistic sources, 2 of the greatest Kabbalistic minds of modern times. And they use what are called sabbatical cycles of 49,000 years of universal existence, established before time synchronized. So this is now going back before God synchronized cosmic time and human time. And their calculation from these sources is that one creation day, that's creation time, is 7,000 divine years. So the relationship between creation time and human time, sorry to have to give you this mathematical thing, but there's the bottom line, is that one creation day is the equivalent to 2.56 billion human years. So if we talk about 6 days in God's frame of reference, it's equivalent in human time to 13.7 billion years. What is the age of the universe according to the most modern space equipment? 7 years ago, 13.8 billion years. According to the Torah and Kabbalah, they could have figured that out already hundreds of years ago. Same as they knew about the Big Bang. If they had listened to the Torah and read Nachmanides, they could have figured out that the Big Bang was actually known 7 centuries ago. They actually have taken this, just to show you how far these Kabbalists have gone. They've actually taken it and looked at creation days and creation hours. This is from Gerald Schroeder, who actually showed that a different calculation, that the stretching of the universe and other calculations from physical principles actually gives the age of the universe at 15.3 billion years. So that's at odds with the microwave background radiation. But there are some sources, physicists, that think that the 13.8 is actually underestimating the actual time, and that it may actually be longer than what people realize, simply because you can't see distant quasars right to the very beginning of time. But that's something I'll leave the astrophysicists to try and determine. According to the Midrash Rabbah, in Talmud, the Sanhedrin, the Tractate of Sanhedrin, on day 6 of creation, that's in God's frame of reference, going back to the 6 days, that the formation of complex life occurred in the 2nd hour of the 6th day. Okay, so they actually have subdivided that day into segments. That's how fine this analysis goes. When Adam becomes part of the human race, when he sins and is expelled from the Garden of Eden, and by the way, the Kabbalists say that that's when mortality was finally instituted. Up until that time, humans were created without any sense of mortality. Once he was expelled, mortality became part of the human existence as well. And that was the beginning of the 10th hour of that day. And I'm just going to show you this. This is 1 page out of about 20 pages in Daniel Friedman's book, talking about the fraction of a second that we have in human time is actually the start of day 1 of the Big Bang. And how many minutes in human time matches what's in the creation story in Berasheet. And you talk about light escaping and so on, and talk about in terms of seconds. They talk about microseconds or nanoseconds for things to occur at the beginning of the Big Bang. Well, in God's day, it was just, the 1st hour of time, He's just mulling along and creating things in his frame of reference. According to human time, it took a fraction of a nanosecond, but for him, it was just part of day 1. And by the 6th day, creating humans, the 10th hour, he decided that Adam was now human. But in our frame of reference, all of these time elements could have been millions and billions of years. So there is no conflict between the cosmic days and the divine days and human days. They are linked by a formula that we have from the sources of the Talmud and Kabbalah. So I've taken you on a journey through 4 different aspects of the creation story. They are linked in a way. And just to show you that science, as sophisticated as we have, cannot beat the Torah and the Talmud and the Jewish sages for the first upmanship here as to who described these things first, and who knew the science, who knew the numbers, and who knew the elements and the time periods. So whether you're looking at the Torah, you're looking at Kabbalah, if you're looking at Talmud, you're looking at all the references that go back over 3,000 years, the age of the universe can be calculated by modern scientific equipment in the 21st century or from the Torah. And like I've said at the end of almost every talk I've given on this, you can find anything in the Torah. And the Torah, 99.99% of the time, is absolutely right. So I hope you've enjoyed that journey, and I hope that it's given me a little bit of insights. And we'll meet again. I don't think we'll be doing Friday mornings just because things are ramping up for a lot of people at work. And but we'll find another day. I want to give you the talk on the hidden meanings of the words. Some of that's going to be jaw-dropping, I tell you. But we'll meet again. So I think, honey, if we could, we can probably just stop the recording.